Let me hit this.
Listen to the voice 17104.com.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice.
My brothers and sisters, welcome to the Richard James Show. You know, we're in the era of Black History. Black History Month starts February 1st to the end of February. And we also celebrate the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, by the way, I want to say something. We're having some technical difficulties with my computer, so my picture will be sort of in and out, but you'll be able to hear me, and certainly you'll be able to see the wonderful videos that I have. And what we want to do is to give you more information about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, one of our greatest icons in civil rights. Frederick Douglass, a known abolitionist. This is who we're going to deal with today. We're going to give you some interesting information. I'll tell you the truth, even just doing some research for this show, I have found a lot of information that I did not know about Brother Douglass. I'm sorry. Let's just talk about and get right into it about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born around, say, 1818. That's a general picture. There's no birth certificate. And he died 1895. So he lived a good life, a long life. But that was his history. And he was born a slave to an African mother and a white, probably the overseer's father. So like our President Barack Obama, Frederick Douglass was a mixed racial ancestry. But let me tell you, you have a drop of black blood, then you consider black. And he wasn't considered a mixed slave, he considered a black slave. But that's just the reality, that he was mixed in ethnicity. And he was a slave, and I think it was at the age of 19 that he broke away, and he went on his own to become a free individual. But the details will be given to you as you look at these interesting and wonderful videos. Now, he was in slavery in Maryland, the state of Maryland, and so Maryland had many slaves, and so he was there, and he was treated cruelly. He was not treated as a kind individual. He was not treated with any kind of respect, and he went through some very, very harsh experiences from his alleged father, really, the overseers, and they treated human beings as if they were animals. So he was determined to free himself, and he did that. Now, there's a whole lot of historical things that happened during his life. If you want to know more about Fred Douglass, you ought to get Frederick Douglass. You should get his books. He has 2 books, autobiographies about the history of his life. Maryland's where he was enslaved, and then he escaped and eventually went north. But I will let some of the videos to give you the actual account of what happened with him. But let's talk about slavery, exactly what the institution of slavery was like. Most of the time, people would escape to the north. But one thing occurred during the Lincoln administration. Remember, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. He was the leader of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party was an anti-slavery party. Lincoln was, before he became a Republican, or shall I say, before he was elected president, he was there was a colonial society, a society that he was a member of, and the colonial society believed that that Africans should have the option of returning home. Now, and Douglas did not agree with that. He felt that they were at home, that conditions should be improved here in this country and not return home. I'll be quite frank with you. I think that slaves should have had that option. Now, according to the statistics that I've taken a look at, over 13,000 Africans returned home. You don't hear much about that, but 13,000 returned to the country of Liberia. Some went to Sierra Leone, and they began to reestablish a colony, Liberia. This was kind of somewhat of an American colony made up of African Americans. Now, some of the local Africans that resented the Africans returning home, so they had off and on conflicts. But Liberia seemed to be doing very well at this point. But Frederick Douglass did not like that. So there were differences between Frederick Douglass and even Abraham Lincoln, even though Douglass supported Lincoln. Now, Douglass considered himself a Republican. Now, there's a series of Black Republican clubs in this country. Now, when I lived in Seattle, Washington for about 11 years, and when I went there, basically had gotten involved in the Republican Party when I was in Harrisburg, and moved to Seattle and continued my activity in the Republican Party. And that's simply because the Republicans were supportive of me and everything that I was doing. And while I was in Seattle, I created a club called the Frederick Douglass Club. I was the founder of that club and was able to gather a number of individuals of like mind. And we believed in freedom, justice, and equality in Seattle. Nowadays, the Republican Club lean toward what we call conservatism. During the time when we created the Republican Club, there were moderate Republicans. They were pro-civil rights Republicans. One group we called the Rockefeller Republicans, because Rockefeller was a strong anti-discrimination party. So that was the era at that time. Now people are leaning toward this conservatism, and the Republican Party has gotten to be more extreme in terms of its policies and its activities, and they allegedly support the policies of Frederick Douglass. But Frederick Douglass was a very proactive in terms of anti-slavery. He was an abolitionist. He was somewhat influenced by William Lloyd Garrison. And Garrison was one of the leading abolitionists of his time. Later on in his history, Frederick Douglass tended to break away from Garrison and start his own newspaper, the North Star, and his own right continued to fight. And the other thing is about Frederick Douglass never had a day of schooling or education. However, he was a brilliant orator, and he was a brilliant spokesman. Frederick Douglass' presentations were just absolutely out of this world. So there's a lot of history, a lot of things that we're gonna talk about this show. But right now we're gonna leave and we're gonna go ahead and show you our videos, and then we'll discuss it. We got a video right now that's coming up. Take a look.
Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the nation's capital, from Washington, D.C. Well, this Black History Month marks the 201st birthday of the renowned abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass was born into slavery in 1818, it is believed. He died a free man in 1895. That's known. On July 5th, 1852, in Rochester, New York, Douglass gave one of his most famous speeches, the meaning of the 4th of July to the American Negro. He was addressing the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. This is an excerpt of James Earl Jones reading the historic address during a performance of Howard Zinn's Voices of a People's History of the United States.
It is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and the crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
James Earl Jones reading the speech of Frederick Douglass. Well, last night, leaders from around the country gathered at the Library of Congress here in Washington, D.C., to honor the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass. The ceremony was the culmination of a year of events marking the bicentennial of the birth of the celebrated abolitionist politician, writer, feminist, educator, entrepreneur, and diplomat. We're joined now by Kenneth Morris, Jr., Frederick Douglass's great-great-great-grandson. He's here in Washington, D.C. to celebrate his ancestors' remarkable legacy. Kenneth Morris, Jr. is the co-founder and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy.
What a legacy. What a legacy.
Wow.
So, especially for young people, tell us about Frederick Douglass. Tell us about his life history and what he would have felt about what's happening today.
Well, he was born into slavery, as you said, sometime in 1818. He was born to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his master was his father. And he had an opportunity in his life where he was taken from the eastern shore of Maryland to be the house servant for his master's brother. And the reason I say it was an opportunity was because when he got there, his slave mistress had never had a slave before and didn't know that it was illegal to teach him. She begins to teach him his ABCs. His master finds out, gets angry, forbids the lessons, but that was all that Frederick Douglass needed, was that little spark of knowledge into his mental darkness. He would teach himself to read and write over the objections of his overseers, escaped slavery at the age of 20 in 1838. He would go on to become an advisor to President Lincoln. He was an ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American U.S. Marshal, and the list goes on, and would pass away in 1895 in his home in Washington, D.C.
And talk about the mark he made, the fight against slavery, the fight, really a leading advocate of women's rights and women's suffrage.
When he first published his autobiography, The Narrative, in 1845, it became a bestseller, and the notoriety from the book threatened his freedom because he was still a fugitive at the time, at the age of 27, and he had to flee to Europe for a couple of years as a cooling off period. And when he was in Europe, he spent some time in Ireland and came into contact with the great Irish liberator Daniel O'Connell. And Daniel O'Connell really helped Frederick Douglass to understand that about human rights and to fight for human rights for everyone. When he would return back to the United States after his abolitionist friends paid for his freedom from his master, he came back with a different mindset, an internationalist mindset to fighting for human rights for everybody. And this is why you see him become one of the first statesmen of any race to fight for women's rights and women's suffrage and to speak out for the rights of immigrants and many other disenfranchised groups.
Well, in 2017, Donald Trump seemed to suggest he thought Frederick Douglass was still alive. This is Trump speaking at a Black History Month event 2 years ago.
I am very proud now that we have a museum in the National Mall where people can learn about Reverend King, so many other things. Frederick Douglass is an example of somebody who's done an amazing job and is being recognized more and more, I notice.
He notices. That was President Trump. It might have been encouraging for you to know, Kenneth, that your great-great-great-grandfather was still alive.
Well, it would have been nice because I've always looked forward to meeting him. And so had he still been alive, that would have been a great thing. But the last time that the two of us were together, we talked about that 2 years ago. And that really has been the gift that keeps
You're
on
talking about
giving.
me and you, not you and President Trump.
Yes, that's correct. The gift that keeps on giving, because it really put his name out there into the public consciousness. And many people know the name Frederick Douglass, but they don't necessarily know what he did or what his contributions were to the country. So there was good and bad that came from that, but as far as our work, the name recognition has really helped us to advance the work in the bicentennial year.
You're moving your institute to Rochester, New York. Why?
Frederick Douglass spent 25 years of his life there. He published the North Star newspaper there, which was the leading abolitionist voice. It's where he chose to be buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. And it is really time for the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and the family of Frederick Douglass to return back to the city that he loved so much. We've been able to develop some great relationships in the community. During the bicentennial year, we worked on a project where we erected 13 statues of Frederick Douglass all around the city at sites that were significant in his life.
Was one of the statues of Frederick Douglass recently vandalized?
It was vandalized, and it's interesting that the site where that statue was vandalized by two students at St. John's Fisher College was the site where a school stood where Frederick and Anna's oldest daughter was enrolled, but she was forced to be segregated from the rest of her classmates. Then eventually Frederick would take her out of the school. So it was interesting that this racist act of tearing down this statue was at the site where Rosetta had suffered racism and segregation.
What do you want to leave people with as we come out of the, well, February 14th is the day you've chosen to celebrate your great-great-great-grandfather's birthday, but especially young people today.
Yeah, well, that's the date that he chose for his birthday. He only saw his mother 4 times his whole life, and she used to call him her little Valentine. So when he was looking for a day to celebrate his birthday, he chose February 14th. But what we would hope young people would take away, I think, is a great story. When Frederick Douglass was near the end of his life at his home here in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C., he loved to walk around the street and interact with the kids. And there was a young man that walked up to him and said, "What advice would you give to a person that's looking to fight for justice and fight for equality?" And without hesitation, Frederick said, "Agitate, agitate, agitate." And he was always agitating. And of course, in the political climate that we're in right now with the divisiveness and the rhetoric, it's really important that activists and young people understand that they can lift their voices and agitate.
And talk about the significance of him being one of the most photographed people back then.
I find it amazing. He was 22 years old, only 2 years removed from slavery, never having spent one day of his life in a classroom. He understood that this new technology, photography, could help him make his arguments for liberation and equality. And he understood that he could present himself in the public as a man worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship. And if we think about the visuals of Frederick Douglass and his intense steely glare in those photographs, especially the young years, he did that intentionally because he said, "I never want to look like a happy, amiable fugitive slave." He's trying to shatter the notion in the public consciousness that these were people of African descent that were not worthy of freedom or citizenship, and perhaps they were better off in slavery, make them an other to justify brutalizing them, exploiting them, and dehumanizing them.
Well, Kenneth Morris, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Kenneth Morris Jr. is the co-founder and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, the great
Frederick Douglass. Yesterday, I watched a video on the inauguration of Wes Moore as the governor of Maryland. Interesting, we're talking about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass also lived in Baltimore for a while, and certainly he was born in the state of Maryland. And Maryland has just elected the 3rd African-American governor in the history of the United States. And his lieutenant governor is the and Ms. Miller is the is Indian. She's a dark skinned with African ancestry Indian. So this happened in the light of our, shall we say, lifting up of Frederick Douglass in his history. Frederick Douglass was enslaved in Maryland, and that's where he worked. Later, when he left I guess the farm and the plantation, he went to the city of Maryland, where he worked down on the on the shore. In terms of the docks, the harbor, I should say, not so much the shore, the harbor, where he did some very difficult work, and later was able to escape, understand on a ship, and find his way north to freedom. One thing that was really a problem during Lincoln's era is the Fugitive Slave Act. That means that when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, in other words, in 1863, when he signed that, it freed the slaves, basically freed the slaves in the South. But yet, these Southerners could go with the Fugitive Slave Act and go north to find their slaves, and then sometime they would capture free folks and then and enslave them and bring them back south. And of course, Frederick Douglass had a very serious problem with that. And that was one of the major differences that they had with Lincoln, because Lincoln allowed that to happen. That was a horrendous and that was a terrible thing. But Lincoln basically was interested, and he said that, in reuniting the nation and bringing the nation back together. Even though slavery was an issue, it wasn't a major issue with Lincoln. Lincoln, being a member of the Colonialization Society, felt that Africans, people of color, slaves, should be able to return to Africa, and he did that. And I'll reiterate and say that again: over 13,000 Africans, people don't know it, went back to Africa. Here's another issue, another thing. Let's go back before Lincoln. Let's go back long before Lincoln, and let's go back to the American Revolutionary War. During that particular time, blacks were not allowed to fight for their freedom. But here's an issue that people don't understand. Britain, who colonized the United States, was the first to free their slaves. Are you hearing me? Britain had freed the slaves long before the United States of America. And they outlawed slavery on the house seas. And as a matter of fact, people don't realize that Britain put up a blockade to block, and they would arrest individuals who was going in to get slaves out of Africa. Britain became anti-slavery. Now, I'm talking about the Revolutionary War period. Let's take a look at it. There were black brigades, Dunbar Raiders. They were known as the Dunbar Raiders, who fought with the British against the Americans. Britain has said to slaves that anyone that fights for England, for the Queen, for Britain, who was a slave, would be freed. Now, when they tell you history, they talk about the brave and the patriotism and all that. They weren't concerned about us. They said, what did he say? We were 1/5 of a human being. Remember the Dred Scott case? There were a black regiment, thousands of black soldiers who fought for the British during the American Revolutionary War. Where our local bigots did not really consider us or consider people of color as human beings. And that's true. A lot of facts, a lot of things to be learned. And Frederick Douglass was in the middle of it when he was on the planet and the work that he did. A strong man, a man who was subject constantly to racism and discrimination that he had to deal with. Situations where he'd gone in socially, situations where whites tried to segregate him. But the one interesting thing about Fred Douglass was his literacy. He actually wrote 2 books. They tell me that his that he was taught how to read at an early age, and he built upon that and basically educated himself. But he did a great job with it. Let's go on to the next video. We find that Frederick Douglass was more than just an abolitionist. And Frederick Douglass also was a diplomat, and he found his way to Ireland. So our next video will deal with Frederick Douglass in Ireland. Let's take a look at it.
Welcome to Quinnipiac University, the home of the Frederick Douglass statue. The statue has been here since 2018. It was first made by Andy Edwards, an English sculptor, and it was commissioned to celebrate the visit of President Obama to Ireland in 2011. The statue is very symbolic. Firstly, it depicts Frederick as a young man. When he visited Ireland in 1845, he was 27 years old. He was designated by the American government to be a fugitive slave. And so he went to Britain and then to Ireland to avoid being recaptured. Other symbolism of the statue is that in Ireland he met his great hero, Daniel O'Connell, the Irish liberator. And so Frederick is seen wearing the cloak typically worn by Daniel O'Connell. The waistcoat or vest is based on one worn by Abraham Lincoln. Douglass advised President Lincoln during the Civil War. Douglass very much believed that so-called colored troops should be allowed to fight alongside white troops. That was allowed finally in 1863, and 2 of Frederick's sons joined up and bravely fought and were awarded medals. Fortunately, they both survived. So the vest is President Lincoln's vest. And then the outstretched right hand is modeled precisely on the right hand of President Obama. And it's particularly poignant because in 1843, Douglass was attacked by a mob who dragged him off a train and broke his right hand. It never set properly again. In the statue's left hand, Frederick is seen clutching his narrative. Frederick wrote his narrative in May 1845. It became an instant success, but it put him in danger of being recaptured back into enslavement. And so his friends persuaded him he needed to leave America. He left Boston in August 1845. He sailed to Liverpool, where he stayed for 2 days. He then sailed on to Dublin. He intended to stay in Dublin for 4 days, but the warmth of the welcome was such he stayed for 4 months. During that time, he gave almost 50 lectures. He later said that being in Ireland was the happiest times of his life. He also described it as transformative. Frederick said that in Ireland, he changed from being simply an abolitionist to being somebody who wanted to champion human rights wherever people were oppressed. So Ireland was very important to this young fugitive slave. When Frederick left Ireland in January 1846, he travelled to Britain. He lectured in Britain for a further 16 months, but there he started to feel homesick. a group of women abolitionists purchased his freedom, and so in April 1847, Frederick was able to return to America a free man. Although he was free, he always faced prejudice. And in America, he devoted the rest of his life to fighting against enslavement and fighting to end prejudice. Frederick never actually knew his year or date of birth. We now know he was born in Maryland in 1818. Frederick actually chose his own birthday. He chose the 14th of February because as a young boy, when he met his mother, and he only saw her a handful of times, on one occasion she referred to him as her little Valentine. One of the reasons why Black History Month is in February is because it coincides with Frederick's chosen birthday. So in 2018, we also held an exhibition at Quinnipiac to honour Frederick Douglass, and particularly his long relationship with Ireland and his great admiration for Daniel O'Connell. The exhibition will be travelling to Ireland and will be featured in the National Famine Museum in Strokestown. Also, the African American Irish Diaspora Network, a group that was formed only in 2020, is going to establish a Frederick Douglass Way in Ireland, which will link up with the National Famine Way. And that is very appropriate because Frederick arrived in Ireland in August 1845, approximately the same time that a deadly blight appeared on the potatoes in Ireland. Although nobody knew at that stage that this was the onset of a major and lethal famine, Frederick noted the poverty of the Irish people, which distressed him, and he likened it to the poverty on the plantations in which he had grown up. In 1847, when the famine was at its height, Frederick sent a donation to a women's group in Belfast who were active in sending money to the west of Ireland. So Frederick was very aware of what was happening in Ireland and was very sympathetic. As an old man in 1887, Frederick returned to Ireland. He said he wanted to look on the faces of those who had given him shelter 40 years earlier. Unfortunately, they had died, but Frederick stayed with their children, and at that point he became convinced that Ireland should be an independent nation. And when he returned to America, he spoke out in favour of Irish independence. It's very clear from all his speeches that Frederick never forgot Ireland or the impact meeting his hero, Daniel O'Connell, had on him.
So we're on O'Connell Street, which in the 19th century was called Sackville Street. And this is a very appropriate part of the tour because Frederick Douglass greatly admired Daniel O'Connell. And as Irish people, we think of Daniel O'Connell as the great Catholic liberator, the man who tried to win independence for Ireland. But in fact, he was so much more. He was a great champion of international human rights. He campaigned against slavery. He campaigned for the rights of Jews. He campaigned for the Maoris in New Zealand, for the rights of Aborigines in Australia, and for the rights of native Indians in so-called British India. So he really was an international champion, and he was very well known on the other side of the Atlantic. And Frederick Douglass first said he heard about Daniel O'Connell when he was a slave, because Daniel O'Connell refused to shake the hands of any American until he knew where they stood on the issue of slavery. So when Frederick came to Ireland, he really wanted to meet O'Connell. And he achieved that on the 29th of September 1845. Daniel O'Connell had been at his home in Kerry. He came back up to address a meeting at Conciliation Hall. It was just across from us, and you notice it's no longer there. So it's gone. But on that evening, Douglass made his way to hear the great liberator speak, and it was so crowded he was at the back of the hall. And when O'Connell sat down and he made his usual speech condemning slavery, when he sat down, the hall thinned out, and Frederick Douglass moved to the front and was introduced to John O'Connell. And John O'Connell said, "You must meet my father." And Daniel O'Connell said, "Wait, don't leave the hall yet. I have this young man from America I want to hear speak." And so Frederick Douglass got on stage of Conciliation Hall and he spoke next to his great hero. And Frederick Douglass was such a great speaker, but he was always very humble. And he started off with his usual self-deprecation, saying, "I am not worthy to be here." And then he went on to make the most magnificent speech. So I would now like to introduce you to Mr. Douglass.
Ladies and gentlemen, and my noble host, having just heard a speech of such eloquence, such beauty, and such wisdom and wit, I now apologize for my own inadequacies as a speaker. But I stand before you to speak on behalf of my people, a people in bondage. Only 7 years ago, I was a slave whose back had been mangled with the lash of the whip. When I was in bondage, I'd often heard of the great Irish liberator in a way that was dear to my heart. I had heard of him in the curses of my masters, and thus I was taught to love him. I've stopped in this country, hoping to see the liberator. And the words which I've just heard him express for my fellow enslaved countrymen and countrywomen have stirred feelings within me which I cannot describe. There was a great bluster and noise in the United States when Mr. O'Connell denounces slavery. I have frequently heard him condemned and denounced by those who oppress the slave. But I am happy to assure you that his words have caused great effect among the American slaveholder, who hate nothing more than being criticized. O'Connell's mighty voice has shaken slavery to the center and paralyzed the soul of the slaveholder. And, ladies and gentlemen, the poor trampled slave of Carolina has heard the name of the liberator with joy and hope. And I myself have heard the wish that some black O'Connell would yet rise up amongst my countrymen and cry, "Agitate! Agitate! Agitate!"
Hello, I'm Quaku Fortune, and it's a pleasure to be here on the 175th anniversary of Frederick Douglass' visit to Dublin. In terms of how I was introduced to him, I was actually quite late in my life. It's mad how, like, I don't know, not internal racism, but just a lack of knowledge. I didn't know that there was black people in Ireland around the famine time. And it was only when I was studying in the Lear, we had to do speeches in Trinity College for our second year programme. And one of the students came to me with this speech from Frederick Douglass. And I'd heard about Frederick Douglass, obviously, but I didn't know his connection with Ireland. I was kind of shocked that he came here at that time and it was so well received and did all these speeches. So it was kind of incredible to realise that and to figure out more about his story and everything that went down. And yeah, so then the speeches I did was his time when he met with Daniel O'Connell firstly, and then when he was leaving his tour, because he basically did tour, he spoke in Dublin and Limerick and Cork. So yeah, it was incredible and lovely to work with Christine. She has such a vast, infinite knowledge of this subject, and not only about Frederick Douglass, she was just talking about loads of black or mixed race people who had been in Ireland around that time, and it was kind of like eye-opening, especially as an actor, because you're like, wow, these people, like, they're playable, or there's a whole plethora of stories that we haven't seen. So it was really incredible. I think Frederick Douglass is a perfect role model for people from new communities as such. As I've said, me learning about him so late, it's an interesting thing in terms of history, especially if you're other or from mixed race backgrounds or black. You're looking for role models and people who you can relate to on screen or like in TV, entertainment, in books. You're always looking for that. And for me, I always felt that in terms of history, there was never really someone I could look at. I mean, I was obsessed with Irish history and really proud of it, but I could never see myself in that. So to find out that like Frederick Douglass came here in the 18th century or around the time of the famine and was like well received and was nearly a hero and was giving speeches, it was actually quite incredible, because coming from a minority, or maybe minority is the wrong word, but coming from like a mixed background, you're nearly inwardly racist to yourself. You don't see yourself in these stories. I would always like look at these period pieces, even on TV, and I'd always like, oh, I'd love to play one of those guys, but I don't think there was any black people back then. That's the kind of things that I would say. So I think to figure out his story and to figure out that he did exist and the amazing journey that he took to get to where he got to, I think it's very important for this generation of people from mixed backgrounds and from black backgrounds to really know about here in this country. So in 1845, Frederick Douglass came to Ireland, and this was just around the time when the famine was starting, and he was just shocked at the peasantry that he saw and the living conditions of these poor Irish people. And it kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but he saw the parallels between slavery in America and the condition of the peasants in Ireland, and was shocked and felt that the problem of humanity was like one the world over. There's always going to be people being squashed and treated badly. And I think he was shocked to see that white people were treated this way as well, which is kind of incredible. In terms of learning the famine in school, I mean, of course, we learn about it and about the mass exodus of people leaving and the starvation and Trevelyan's corn and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's a very important thing to remember, and it's kind of incredible how this happened at the same time where a black man was in Ireland giving speeches to white people about the abolishment of slavery, and people who supported him and treated him as an equal, which is kind of, you have these two kind of parallels, which is very interesting. I'd like to think that his message resonates today, yes, 100% around the world, because it's obviously not just in Ireland, and everything that's going on at the minute is quite highly charged racially, so I'd like to think people would remember that. Ireland is a funny place, and it has an interesting history with racism. The way we treat our own is in like the travelling community is nearly worse than white Irish people would treat people from Nigeria or black people. So I think, would it resonate? I'd hope so, especially in this day and age. And I think the words that he's spoken are very important and very, very, very important at this stage. So I would hope so.
In September of 1838, Frederick Douglass, who was a slave about the age of 20 years old, dressed in a sailor's uniform that had been given to him by a free black woman named Anna Murray. Frederick then boarded a train in Baltimore, Maryland, heading north. He had with him a document called a Seaman's Protection Certificate that was generously given to him by a free black dock worker named Samuel Fox. It was a required document for people of color to move within slave states, and it entailed grave risk, both for Douglass and for Samuel Fox. 24 hours later, after travel by train, ferry, and steamboat, Douglass arrived in New York City and for the first time in his life knew the feeling of freedom. Douglass said, "It was a moment of the highest excitement I have ever experienced." Frederick Douglass didn't stay in New York long. Because the city was full of bounty hunters searching for runaway slaves, sympathetic people guided him further north for greater safety. But before leaving New York, Frederick sent for Anna Murray, and with the help of his new friends, Frederick and Anna were married. They quickly traveled on to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they settled for 4 years. It was here that Frederick, whose original name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, became Frederick Douglass to further distance himself from the dangers of his slave past. Frederick and Anna were welcomed into a Quaker community in New Bedford, and Douglass found work as a laborer. Douglass was also introduced to William Lloyd Garrison's publication, The Liberator, which galvanized him. He said, "My soul was set on fire. Its sympathy for my brethren in bonds, its scathing denunciations of slaveholders, its faithful exposures of slavery, and its powerful attacks upon the upholders of the institution sent a thrill of joy through my soul, such as I have never felt before." 3 years after arriving in Bedford, Douglass attended an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, where he was encouraged to speak. Although nervous and reluctant to address a group of white people, the account he gave of his experiences of slavery was so moving and compelling that he was instantly recognized as a natural spokesman for the cause of abolitionism. William Lloyd Garrison hired him as an anti-slavery lecturer, and Douglass began a career as one of the most inspiring and storied spokesmen ever to fight slavery and injustice. As an itinerant lecturer on abolitionism for the American Anti-Slavery Society, life could be difficult for Frederick. He was often expected to travel and live in segregated conditions, which he refused to do. In some locations, especially in the West, he was met by pro-slavery mobs. In 1843, Douglass was beaten up and his hand was broken. And then there were those who refused to believe that the extraordinarily eloquent and well-mannered black man speaking to them had actually been a slave. In response, Douglass wrote his autobiography, titled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. It was published in May of 1845 and became an immensely popular bestseller, both in the U.S. and in Europe. But with the publication and admission of his slave background, Frederick Douglass was no longer safe, even in the free North. His friends and abolitionist associates urged him to travel abroad. So he departed from Boston in August of 1845, headed across the Atlantic. Several weeks later, he arrived in Dublin, Ireland, by way of Liverpool, to begin 20 months of touring, writing, and lecturing throughout Ireland and Britain. This was also the time when Ireland's Great Famine had its start. During his time away from America, Frederick was, for the first time in his life, dependent entirely on himself for his own well-being. He was helped by the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers, and other anti-slavery groups, but without William Lloyd Garrison's regular sponsorship. Douglass now arranged his own speaking schedule and itinerary, and raised funds for travel by selling copies of his narrative, including newly published Irish and British Isles editions of the book. Frederick savored the experience of living as a free person and gained maturity and self-reliance. He wrote, "I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man. I employ a cab. I am seated beside white people. I reach the hotel. I enter the same door. I am shown into the same parlor. I dine at the same table, and no one is offended. I find myself regarded and treated at every turn with the kindness and deference paid to white people." Douglass also gained confidence to speak about more than descriptions of life under slavery, and began to explore a wider range of topics. But he quickly discovered, through some early missteps, the wisdom of avoiding debate on especially charged subjects with which he had little direct experience, such as the tensions between Catholics and Protestants. He finished his tour of Ireland and England as someone who had made a personal evolution. He wrote, "I can truly say I have spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country. I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life." In December of 1846, a group of women abolitionists led by Anna Richardson in England took steps to purchase Frederick Douglass's freedom from Hugh Auld and his brother Thomas, who still owned Frederick. The amount given to purchase him was £150 sterling. It was this fact that finally allowed Frederick Douglass to return to the United States as a truly free man without the threat of recapture. Douglass sailed back to the United States in April of 1847 and moved with Anna and their children to Rochester, New York. There he began writing and editing a newspaper titled The North Star, whose motto was, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." The following year, the first Women's Rights Convention was held at Seneca Falls, New York, and Frederick, the only African American to attend, made a supportive address and signed the Declaration of Sentiments in favor of women's rights. Through his newspapers and lectures over the next 15 years, Frederick Douglass became one of the most well-known and respected Black Americans. He wrote his second book, titled My Bondage and My Freedom, in 1855. He and Anna had 5 children, 4 of whom survived, and after the start of the Civil War in 1861, Douglass worked to promote the freedom, welfare, and rights of his fellow African Americans. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln invited Douglass to confer about how to end the prolonged tragedy of the Civil War and how to end slavery in the process. They also discussed ways to attract more Southern Black men to fight for the North and the need to compensate them. In the years after the war, Douglass was appointed to several political positions, including U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, and later Minister Resident and Consul General to Haiti. Towards the end of his life, Frederick visited his slave master, Thomas Auld. Frederick wrote, "I had by my writings made his name and his deeds familiar to the world in 4 different languages. Yet here we were, after 4 decades, once more face to face, he on his bed, aged and tremulous, drawing near the sunset of life, and I, his former slave, United States Marshal of the District of Columbia, holding his hand and in friendly conversation with him in a sort of final settlement of past differences." It was a dramatic and profoundly significant change of circumstances for both men. In 1882, Anna Douglass, Frederick's wife of 44 years and mother of their 5 children, died. 2 years later, Douglass remarried, this time to Helen Pitts, who was white. But there was opposition from both family and friends, and Douglass said they would have had no objection to my marrying a person much darker in complexion than myself, but to marry one much lighter and of the complexion of my father rather than of my mother was, in the popular eye, a shocking offense, and one for which I was to be ostracized by white and black alike. Perhaps to escape, Frederick and Helen began a tour of Europe and the British Isles. Helen returned home before Frederick did, and he revisited Dublin, Ireland. While there, he spoke in favor of Irish Home Rule. 8 years later, on February 20th, 1895, Frederick Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women. Susan B. Anthony walked him to the stage, where he addressed the audience. Later that evening, when he was back at home, Frederick died of a heart attack. He was buried in Rochester, New York, next to his first wife, Anna. Few men have had such a deep impact on American life and culture, especially the relationship between white people and people of color. Frederick Douglass observed that in a country as diverse as ours, there should be no rich, no poor, no high, no low, no white, no black, but common country, common citizenship, equal rights, and a common destiny. He lived his life in dedication to the principle that right is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren.
Frederick Douglass, one of the greatest individuals that ever lived on the planet Earth. Frederick Douglass, a man who dedicated his entire existence fighting for to end slavery, for equal opportunity, and to get people out of bondage. And Frederick Douglass learned and grew as he grew older. Began to find out that not only are Africans in bondage, there are other forms of discrimination and hate. the white race. How do you discriminate against 55% of your own race? Women not allowed the right. Women not given the kind of respect they should get. Discriminated against in every kind of way. This is, when I say women, I'm talking about white women. I'm talking about Asian women. I'm talking about every kind of woman. And Frederick Douglass took a stand against this form of discrimination and sexism. He was against that. He's dedicated his life to bringing about change and to bringing about equality for all people. These are the kinds of things that we're going to bring to you on the Richard James Show. We're going to look at icons and lift them up. And people that you've heard the name, you're going to learn more about them. It's critically important for us to understand where we came from, to understand our past. That will help us know what our future will be. We started out with Martin Luther King Jr. and Martin Luther King Jr.'s participation in the civil rights movement in Chester, Pennsylvania. King grew and became a man in Chester. So we started out with King, and now we moved on to Frederick Douglass, and then we're going to move on again to other individuals that are fought for freedom. One thing I like about Frederick Douglass, let me just say this. He also was extremely intelligent. He was not a pacifist. One of the differences that he had with William Lloyd Garrison is that William Lloyd Garrison did not believe in war. He was a pacifist. But Fred Douglass was not. He felt that, at some point, sometime you have to pick up arms. As a matter of fact, two of his sons fought in the Civil War. Frederick Douglass had a meeting with a revolutionary in Chambersburg, Maryland, and trying to prevent them from starting an altercation. And that altercation took place, and the individuals lost that altercation. They lost that war. So he had common sense, and even though he believed that the North had to fight, as a matter of fact, one incident that occurred that really helped prompt and started the Civil War was Robert Small in South Carolina, when they had a naval incident that really sparked the whole conflict. But Frederick Douglass himself, no one loves war. No one loves conflict. But if there is war, it's important to be on the right side, of justice. Frederick Douglass did this, and he did many things, and learned a lot about the world when he traveled to Ireland. This is something that I did not realize that he did. He traveled to Ireland and learned from some of the Irish freedom fighters in Ireland. Learned about oppressed people in other parts of the world. First of all, he found out that the Irish themselves were oppressed. That there were differences between Protestants and Catholics, Northern Ireland, and also just supported the independence of Ireland. He also traveled to Scotland. He knew about oppressed people and supported oppressed people, for example, in Australia. You had people in Australia who were the original people of Australia, who were poisoned and treated very, very poorly. So in other words, the gathering together of people in terms of unity against oppression. That was the lifestyle, the commitment that we got from Frederick Douglass, a wonderful man. And I was happy, as I said earlier, to create what was known as the Frederick Douglass Club, and found out that the club is still working and doing some things. I met some very wonderful people and worked with some wonderful people in Seattle, Washington. You know, during the 11-year period that my wife and my family stayed. But we was a gentleman by the name, for example, of Norwood Brooks. Norwood Brooks was city treasurer at one point. He was also given appointed in a position as director of employment agency for the state of Washington. And there were others. There were people who were really, really active and involved in doing things, and we got a few things done. Okay, we're getting down near the end of our journey, and again, we want to remind you that we are still at 35 South 8th Street in the city of Lebanon. We have our stand, and here's a picture of our stand. You see giraffes, you see oils. We got original oil pictures. We have statues. We have a lot of things, and that can accommodate most people. So if you enjoy this kind of thing, if you enjoy African clothing, for example, and we got some slew of new African outfits for men, and we got mud cloth. There you go. There's some of the outfits that we have in. And look at the drums. We have djembe drums, reasonably priced, more reasonable than you'll find on Amazon or order that. So come to see us. Come to see us in Lebanon. We love to see you, and everybody is welcome. Everybody is welcome to come to our business. And by the way, we can't make it without you. Some folks say they want to stop and, hey, here's this picture of Reverend Dr. Gaskin and myself at the Kwanzaa celebration. That was a wonderful, hey, that's a beautiful dashiki, Reverend Gaskin. That is pretty darn sharp, I tell you. It was a wonderful, wonderful occasion in there. Here's some of the things that we displayed at the Kwanzaa celebration. Some of our mud cloth, some of our drums, some of our material. And if you like nice things, you come see us. But there's some of our masks. So again, I want to say to you, thanks again for tuning in. And may God bless you, and may heaven smile upon you. Until next week, this is Richard James saying so long, and God bless. And thank you, Chris, for your continued work and your continued expansion and the development of the Voice 17104. On his way. The Voice is on his way. Check us out. Continue to look at the shows that are presented and get the information that is presented on The Voice from the many, many contributors. Okay. All right, then. God bless and thank you and take care. So long.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. And thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let's hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.